Let's see, I think we can get started. So hi everyone, welcome to our virtual field trip today. Melting glaciers and rivers gone wild. We're really excited to see you all. My name is Sharon London, and I'm the philanthropy director for Washington's National Park Fund. Our CEO Lori Ward couldn't be here today, so I'm stepping in for her. And it's my pleasure to see you all here today. It's really fun to be the MC for this field trip. I've been organizing these in the background, and this is our 21st field trip. So first, a little bit about Washington's National Park Fund. We've been growing strong for years. We have a 20-person board of directors and 7 staff, and we work really hard to help the 3 national parks here in Washington State. We work closely with the park superintendents to figure out what are the high priority projects for each year, and we help fund those. And our vision is to see that our parks are strong and vibrant, youthful and everlasting. And when COVID-19 hit, we thought, well, if we can't take people to Mount Rainier or North Cascades or Olympic National Park, let's take the parks to the people. And I know that a lot of you have really appreciated that, so thank you. So is your pack ready? Do you have your hiking boots on? Are you ready to get on the virtual bus and travel over to Mount Rainier National Park? And as you're enjoying this trip, please put any questions that come up in the Q&A box at the bottom, and we'll get to them at the end. We also have closed captioning available if you need it. So first, about our speaker. Paul Kennard has been an earth scientist for 40 years, specializing in glaciers, landslides, and rivers. He recently retired as the regional geomorphologist stationed at Mount Rainier National Park. He provided technical assistance to Mount Rainier and other parks on the effects of climate change on glaciers and downstream impacts, including river flooding and debris flows. Paul is also receiving the Carolyn Dobbs Research Award today for his outstanding work at Mount Rainier National Park. So congratulations, Paul, and please take it away, and I will hide myself, and you can start your screen share when you're ready.
Well, thank you very much, Sharon. I really appreciate the opportunity to present today. I'll get the slideshow started right now. And I'll be talking about melting glaciers and rivers gone wild, and essentially what the parks are trying to do to protect themselves. And my name is Paul Kennard, and I'm a recently retired geomorphologist. And my entire career, I was stationed at Mount Rainier National Park. Mainly, I'm going to be talking about, though, how the parks use geomorphic analysis, or basically scientific analysis, to help protect their roads and buildings from increasing floods. And in that way, they can maintain public access and safety. And this is really important when the design conditions, or the conditions that they're trying to design their roads and buildings to withstand from the floods, are changing. And they're changing because of climate change. And as the main example, I'll be using Mount Rainier, which many of you from the area know is just south of Seattle by about 100 miles. And one thing that Mount Rainier is very well known for is many glaciers. It has lots of glaciers. And in fact, it has more glacier ice than all the other Cascade volcanoes combined. There's 25 named glaciers, well over 30 miles of square ice, a full cubic mile of ice volume, if you put it all in a big square mile by a mile by a mile, and it's the most glaciated massif in the continental United States.
Hey, Paul, I think you need to turn on your share screen still.
The screen didn't come up?
Nope.
I hit share screen. Okay, should I take it from the top?
I think you could just, we see the numbers, so I think you can just keep going from where you were at.
Okay, sorry about that.
Oh, no problem.
Well, we're starting from the start. I'll just get back to where we were. So we saw that Mount Rainier had a lot of glacier ice. And the problem is that these glaciers are melting. Between 1913 and 1994, a full quarter of the ice was lost. And starting in about 2003, the park started its own program of measuring whether glaciers are getting bigger or smaller. And since then, a full another fifth of the ice has been lost. And this is a much faster loss rate. In fact, it's been losing ice more recently at a rate 600% higher than historic. So the glaciers, unfortunately, are melting quite quickly because of climate change. And I'll play this twice, and this just shows the retreat of the terminus of the Nisqually Glacier over a few years. And what it does is it exposes a tremendous amount of essentially loose dirt or unconsolidated sediment. And as you can see where it's labeled number 1, a lot of this very loose material is suddenly exposed on very steep slopes where it's very easy to move during our fall storms where we get a huge amount of precipitation and rain. Also, when glaciers are healthy, and now we're looking at label number 2, they make a large pile of dirt when they're healthy and advancing, and they deposit a large amount of dirt to the side, and it's called a lateral moraine. And when the ice moves back, it's no longer buttressing or resting up against that large pile of dirt. And you have a several 100-foot high pile of very loose material that will basically, you look at it cross-eyed and it falls into the river. So it's very unstable. And then glaciers have a river coming from them that runs at the base of that pile, and it often is enough to cause that sediment to fall into the rivers. So this is a view of the bottom of the Emmons Glacier, and you can see how dirty and how much material there is, and how much material is spilling into the river as it comes from the glacier. And basically what happens is the river starts to flow, it can cut into the sides of that loose material, and even more material comes in. So essentially a huge amount of material is coming from the glaciers and getting in our rivers. The second thing that's happening is we're getting an increase in debris flows. And debris flows are landslides that can start quite small, but they travel for miles. And as they go down the valley, they actually bulk up and get bigger and bigger. And when the valley gets wide enough and flat enough, it deposits a big pile of everything that it's scoured on the way down. And you can see that boulder next to the person in here, and it tosses those boulders and old growth trees like they're pickup sticks. In fact, we're still having debris flows at Mount Rainier, and the most recent were in the fall of 2019, where 2 of them hit our West Side Road. So what's happening is the glaciers are retreating, and they're putting a lot of sediment into the rivers. And when you have just a little flood, it doesn't have to be a big one, the water is carrying quite a bit of this sediment. And then when the water recedes, it drops that sediment on the bed of the river. That happens again. It drops a little more. And in this way, the bed of the river just keeps building up until finally the bed of the river is literally higher than the banks of the river and is very easily able to access the road or building that's next to it. And that's what's happening at Mount Rainier. So we're getting lots of sediment, and that's called aggradation. And you can see here, if you look on the left, the old growth trees have died because of so much sediment being deposited in the river. It literally smothered them. So we're going to try a Zoom poll here where you get to answer this question. How fast do you think that Mount Rainier's rivers are filling up with dirt? Do you think it's an inch per century, an inch per year, an inch per decade, or over a foot per decade? So you should see a screen now where you can actually take your best guess at what rate you think the rivers are filling up at. So the rivers are filling from sediment being poured in by the glaciers. And we're tallying up the votes right now. Well, it looks like 4% of you chose 1 inch per century. A lot more of you, 27%, were at an inch per year. 7% was an inch per decade. And 62%, or almost 2/3 of you, did a foot per decade. And I'll give the answer now. And the historic rate had been under 3 inches per decade. But the current rate, and you're a very smart audience, it's well over a foot per decade. In fact, it's been recently estimated up to 3 feet per decade. And it's very variable across the park, both in space and time, so it's hard to get an exact number. But the park geologist who does the work assures me it's well over a foot per decade. And unfortunately, that represents a 400% increase over the historic rate. So our rivers are filling up pretty quickly. And an example of what happens is when the rivers fill up is seen on the White River, which is in the northeast part of the park. And the White River runs next to State Route 410. And for people from the area, if you follow the highway that's on the right of the picture here, and you go out of the park about a mile past, you'll cross the entrance road to Crystal Mountain Boulevard, just to give you perspective. But anyway, if you were here and you walked into the forest at the left, you'd be walking uphill and you'd walk a couple hundred yards and you'd hit the actual main stem of the White River, which is a very large river. And it turns out the bottom of that river, the land at the bottom of the water would be a full 16 feet above the road on the right. So it's just the inversion of the classic river you've maybe learned in your geology classes in school, where the river is at the bottom of the valley. Here, the rivers are literally above the floodplain next to them because of so much sediment coming into them. And even this little flood channel, which we can see in the picture here, during low flows in the summer, flows above the White River. So it's no surprise that every time there's a minor flood, State Route 410 gets a lot of sediment on it. But fortunately, we haven't lost the whole road yet. In addition to all these roads, into the rivers filling up with sediment, we're getting bigger and more frequent floods. So our storms are coming more frequently because of climate change. In fact, on the Nisqually River, what used to be a 100-year flood is now occurring every 14 years. So we're getting very large floods much more frequently. And this double whammy of increasing river floods and a decreasing ability of the river to carry all that material is causing a huge amount of problems. And the park has been experiencing significant flood problems, especially since 2003. And we've been getting all sorts of road failures. If you have a road crossing a mountain stream at right angles, the stream can overwhelm the road during a flood and take out, do quite a bit of damage, but the damage is quite limited. It's usually a several hundred feet or so. But when the road runs next to the river, roads, it turns out, are quite smooth compared to a forest. So if water flows out of a river and hits the road, it much prefers running down a road. Like the road is almost a magnet for the flow. And they can literally become the new river. And that way you can actually damage miles of road because the river just keeps running down the road. So that's a much more damaging situation. As a result of all this, though, the park unfortunately has been losing a steady loss of roads and campgrounds and public access. The Carbon River has been closed since 2006 and is unlikely to open in its current location ever. The West Side Road is a very popular road, but has been closed to the public since about 1980. And it used to get 50,000 visitors, and you can imagine how many visitors it will get now. And it's a tremendous portal for many excellent hiking trails that are much harder to get to because you have to go by foot or bike now. The park's only year-round campground, Sunshine Point, washed out in 2006, and there's no plans to rebuild it. And the main park road, the Nisqually Road that goes to Paradise, that's open year-round, has 4 or 5 areas that are at the highest risk of failure. And we've seen the White River, where the river is up to 20 feet above the surrounding forest. It too is at the highest risk. And because of this, we're losing a lot of non-hiking access, and we're unable to maintain the cultural resources. And basically, this loss of access really conflicts with the National Park Service mission, which includes the public enjoying the resources that are there. And to add insult to injury, last winter, there was about 12 inches of rainfall near the park in February, and every single park entrance was blocked. And the main Nisqually entrance was blocked by a debris flow. And on the right, you can see what the road looked like after it. And unfortunately, there was a group of residents who lived on the wrong side of the debris flow, about 200 of them, and they were literally stranded until the park was able to open up the road at the end of February. And historically, what the park had done, they sort of had one focus. They used really large rock, which is called riprap, to protect anytime there was flood damage. And this shows a levee that's at the entranceway of the park at the Nisqually entrance. And this levee also runs outside the park and protects that housing development where those people in the previous slide had been stranded just outside the park. And traditionally, it was outside agencies that decided, designed, and funded our flood protections. And they weren't always listening to the park. And to be fair, the park didn't really always have expertise to give, that specialized expertise needed to be able to protect against flooding. The problem is that riprap has limitations and aquatic impacts. Not only is it ineffective flood protection, often riprap will fail the first time it gets wet during a moderate flood. Additionally, fish biologists have found that there's almost no fish usage where you have riprap and rock in a river. And if you're able to use wood, though, when you're coming up with a flood protection structure, there's much more fish usage. And the Nisqually levee, in fact, has been damaged by as small as a 2-year flood. And a 2-year flood occurs on average every year or two, and sometimes we'll have more than one 2-year flood in a year. And in fact, the levee has been damaged and repaired, and each repair has cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's been done 4 times since 2006, and a 5th repair is scheduled. And that's because the park does not have any control of how that levee is maintained. However, with park-funded repairs, I was able to start influencing some of the flood fixes, mainly because the park was coming up with the money. In 2006 and 2007, the White River campground was damaged, and we were able to hire a consultant who specialized in making what's called barbs to protect infrastructure. And he had a lot of experience on Alaskan rivers, which, if you think of it, are actually like Mount Rainier rivers, where they start from glaciers. And barbs are rock structures that face upstream. And there's a picture of it here, and it's designed to be overtopped by the flow. And when it does that, the energy of the stream is deflected away from the bank back towards the center of the river. And the great thing about barbs is they use 1/3 the amount of rock of riprap, meaning they're much less expensive. And also you can do anything you want in between the barbs, such as plant new riparian plantings, but mainly they work. And we installed 6 barbs on the White River Road, and it's worked great ever since we installed it. The only downside is that we had to bring in a consultant, which just represents a high cost to the park instead of doing it in-house. Next, I was able to secure some grant funding, and we came up with a solutions manual. We wanted to give a lot of different ideas of what the park could do. And this was designed to be used by the maintenance crews at Mount Rainier and Olympic National Park. And I won't go into any detail. I don't want to read through this table, but I just want you to notice that we tried to characterize each option by characteristics that would be useful to the maintenance department making a decision on which to use. And we went from very small fixes that were very inexpensive to the Cadillac of fixes, that cost a lot of money and were super well engineered. So we had everything. And it was essentially designed for the road crews to be able to go out with a solution manual, try to match up what, the problem they saw with a fix, and they'd bring it back to the design crew at the maintenance, and they'd go forward with the fix. And it's still being used by both parks. And ultimately, we were able to get Mount Rainier to install an engineered log jam on an area that was threatened to close our main Nisqually Road near Longmire. And engineered log jams are the Cadillac of flood protection. And essentially, they're designed to mimic natural wood deposits that happen in rivers if you leave the river completely alone. And wood can be very stable in a river for literally hundreds and thousands of years. So they were designed based on those principles, but they're highly engineered. And on the right there, you can see the engineered log jam, and it's kind of like looking at an iceberg. What you see is only a very small part of the engineered log jam. If you look on the lower left, you can see the way it's built is they put pilings as far as 30 feet down into the bed of the river or until it hits bedrock. Then they make a wood crib and fill it with rock, so it's bomb-proof and very stable, cover the whole thing with dirt, and then they rack wood against it, and it begins looking more and more natural as it catches, as the river runs by it and more wood accrues on the outside of it. And the engineered log jam works so well on the Nisqually River that the park put in 5 or 6 more on the Carbon River that are also performing really well. So what the problem, though, the park was facing is they were getting larger and more frequent storms from glacier loss due to climate change and increased debris flows and catastrophic flooding. And sort of from the logistic perspective, their flood responses just were not adequate for the changing conditions. The funding agencies weren't adapting fast enough. And when the parks tried to compensate, they had to spend more and more on consultants and contractors. And actually, some of the park staff, were justifiably skeptical because these were very new to them approaches and very different from what they've been doing in the past. So we decided what we needed to approach this was sort of a multi-phased approach of assessing, prioritizing, and fixing flood hazards. And those steps became our Imminent Threats Flood Program. And if you sort of visualize a Venn diagram, it lives at the intersection of science, engineering, and policy. And it's basically a science-based process that has an adaptive management or learning component. So if something works, we go yes and keep using it. Something doesn't work, we try something else. But most importantly, we wanted to develop accurate information that was easily understood and usable by management. And our pilot project was the West Side Road, which is that road we saw earlier that had been closed to the public since the 1980s. And the reason it was closed, as you can see our poor beleaguered West Side Road on the far left of this slide. On the right of the slide, you can see Tahoma Creek, and it drains the South Tahoma Glacier, which is on the south side of the mountain and gets a lot of sunlight and had been rapidly deteriorating and falling apart. And as it fell apart, it didn't go quietly into the night, and it put out a large number of outburst floods and debris flows, literally dozens of them. And those debris flows killed the old growth forest that was between Tahoma Creek and the West Side Road. And Tahoma Creek was one of those creeks where the bed of it had gotten higher than the forest. So when the forest died, it fell off its bed, and just like a windshield wiper across the windshield, it swept across the floodplain. It widened over 500 feet, hit 3 different channels, and basically ended up on top of the West Side Road. And it took only a short time for those forests to die during the debris flows, but because it's such a disturbed and difficult area, it'll take centuries to recover our hundreds of year old old growth trees. So basically, we're going to have a very long-term problem with the road. And what was happening with the road, and you can see it on the left, it became the river. It was destroyed every winter. And usually what the maintenance crew did is there was a landslide nearby that they used the spoils or the landslide deposit from that, and that was consisting of small material, fines and gravels. And on the right, you can see in brown, they rebuilt the road. And it was often done, since they did it every year, they kind of got used to just doing it without going through a thing we call the compliance process, which is essentially an environmental review. But the big problem in my mind is that the fines and gravels, that small stuff that they rebuilt the road, was so much smaller than the gray stuff you see on the lower right that's in the river, the boulders and cobbles. Now that river is moving the boulders and cobbles, so it has no problem moving those small stuff up the road. And again, it was washing out every year. So we decided to apply our new imminent threats process. And the first step is the hazard assessment. What are we designing our road to take? Now I was doing this on a very limited budget. So I was working with paid interns. We used a thing called the Geologist in the Park program. And sometimes we also used volunteers, and it was done under my supervision. And the first geologist in the park did a great job of looking at the hazards. First thing he looked at were the slopes. Now you have a slope going downriver, but you also can have a slope across the valley, and that's called the cross-valley gradient. And it turns out that cross-valley gradient was steeper than the down-valley gradient. And not only that, 90% of the cross-valley gradients by the road tilted towards the road. Because of that, all that erosive energy from the stream was going right into the road. So the first thing he looked at, the slopes, basically were a big strike one against the, keeping in the road. That was not a good thing that he found. Next, he looked at how high the road was compared to the stream. On average, the road was a modest 7 feet or so above, but unfortunately in areas it was as low as 12 feet below the stream. And when he did some modeling, he showed that basically every winter the road was going to flood, just with small floods. So that was kind of strike two. And Matt went through several other criteria. And what we did after that first step is we went back to the management team and they said, well, we understand it's a very difficult area, but we'd like to at least proceed with the next step, which is to see if we can come up with any solutions that might be able to address those hazards. So the next summer, we moved into the developing solutions phase. And I got another geologist in the park, Mitch Haynes, and he came up with a whole suite of solutions from soup to nuts. And again, I'm not going to read through it, but he went from basically very inexpensive things to do to very expensive things that we probably won't do, but that were bomb-proof. But I do want you to note that he tried to characterize each of the options by things that were usable to management. For example, he gave the relative cost and how effective it was expected to be. That way the management could do kind of a cost-benefit thing. Then he also looked at, would it be easy or hard to get through the compliance process? And would it have many side environmental impacts? And we went through all these solutions and we ended up recommending, and the management team ended up accepting, sort of a double solution called on-echelon logs and log bundles. And what that consisted of is on the upper part of where the road was eroding, we were just going to lay these large trees that had blown down the winter before and put them against the road with the root wads facing essentially upstream. And then we're going to put a bunch of rocks on top of it to hold them in place and then rebuild the road over it. And lower down, we were going to do a similar thing, but we were going to use bundles of logs and they would be spaced regularly. And they would be also covered with large rock and then covered with fines to make a driving surface. And also they decided to go with what's called bioengineering, or using live vegetation plantings to help make the whole thing stronger. The roots actually can make these structures much stronger. And we brought on a volunteer, Jenny Chan, and she proposed putting in yellow here native plantings by the edge of the road, and then what's called willow wattles on the part of the road sloping to the river, and then natural riparian plantings in the river itself. And we'll see these in a second. And the management team decided to implement it because it was relatively cheap. And it turns out we had all the trees that had blown down the winter before in a bad windstorm. So it was relatively cheap to go forward. And the third summer, we went ahead with construction and got another geologist in the park, Robbie Joust. He had just gotten his geology degree. And we said, hey, Robbie, you get to supervise the largest construction project in the park. Have fun with it. And he took a gulp and went ahead and did a really good job. And he worked with maintenance and said, this is what we're trying to do. And the maintenance crew was really great. And they said, yeah, we think we can do that. We'll try to make it look like what you're envisioning. And this shows where they're installing those log bundles. So they first created a big slot in the road, and they didn't really dig down into the river, which is really better from an aquatic perspective, but they dug sort of along the bed into the road to make a slot where they could place the large logs that were placed at about 70-degree angle to the road. And they had the root wads facing the stream side. And then on top of that, they poured really large rock to hold that wood down at the bottom. And what happened is those big log bundles, when you had a flood there, those log bundles would act as a big frictional component to the flow. And they would take all the erosive energy in the water and just dissipate it harmlessly into basically into turbulence and heat. And they'd sort of defang or suck the erosive energy out of the water and just wash it downstream as another kind of energy. And then they covered the rock and the bundles with that fine material. And that was, now the road was high enough that it wasn't going to flood, every year. And that small material helped bind the rock, and it gave a much better surface to both drive on and to do some plantings. And Jenny Chen came in and did some plantings. And this shows where she's using willow cuttings to make a weaved surface called a willow wattle that actually lives and grows. And this shows it after it's been installed. And this shows the willow wattle at the end of the summer. We had a very dry summer, so there was some dying off, but it actually still is alive. And those plants are still alive today, and they're getting bigger and bigger. So now that we built it, the next step was to see how it did. So that's called the monitoring portion. And on the left, again, we show the before the fix, and then on the right, after the fix in the summer of 2016. And we were immediately tested by some relatively large floods where the river actually ran against the road. And this shows a relatively modest flood in 2017, no damage to the road, everything working fine. A larger one in September 2019, and then the biggest one that was in August 2019. And the surprising thing there is that they actually had 2 debris flows. And we told the management team that if there were debris flows, all bets were off. But the road has held up perfectly ever since. So we're very pleased with the design. And the design worked so well, they decided to try it on the trails. And this shows the couch crossing on the Wonderland Trail, which is the trail that goes around Mount Rainier, and it used to wash out every year. And the imminent threats technician decided to incorporate large wood into holding in the trail so that it wouldn't wash out. And this shows what it looks like after they reconstructed it. And they also did some bioengineering here. And they had to do it they didn't have a large budget, so they actually had a volunteer crew. And this shows our then Superintendent Randy King enjoying both the volunteer crew and the rain while doing some planting. And that trail fix has not failed since, so that worked out tremendously too. And now it's worked so well that they're bringing it and applying that imminent threats process to all the other geohazards, such as rockfall, seen here in Stevens Canyon. And what used to be on the left now, that used to be our West Side Road parking, was a rockfall area, and they've now moved it. The problem was, though, the program initially had no funding. I would sort of scrape together funding year to year. And I was relying on really great interns, but they were performing well above their experience level. Remember Robbie sort of being, taking over the largest construction project. And the problem is that they would leave every year, so there was no institutional memory. And the worst part is I was about to retire. But the park stepped up. They thought it was working so well, and then even spending money on these fixes was saving them so much money in the long term that they committed to long-term funding. And now the program is continuing, even though I've retired, as a long-term program under the park geologist, Scott Beeson. And the last thing I wanted to mention, I've been talking on and on about Mount Rainier, but this same process can be used easily regionally, and it can certainly be applied to all the other Cascade volcanoes. In fact, it can be applied to any other of the glaciated peaks in Washington, and it can actually be applied statewide or nationally. And some of the other parks have been showing great interest in it. And so we expect this process to become more and more widespread as time goes through and climate change becomes more apparent to these other parks. And I really thank you so much for the opportunity to present, and I'd be more than happy to take any questions if we have some time.
Let's see, thank you. Thank you so much, Paul. I'm gonna stop your video. And we do have a number of questions, and I certainly have learned a lot about the Imminent Threats Program, barbs, willow wattles. That's amazing. That's awesome. So Mike writes, the West Side Road project is outstanding and a good example of log deflections in high flow situations. Great job. So that's good to hear.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then I'll read some of the questions in the Q&A box. So how much water that's been powering these floods comes from the melting glaciers? I'm having trouble imagining the scope of the melts. Has rainfall increased lately?
Yeah, the actual floods, except there's two things. The things we get in the summer, the debris flows, that happen during hot water, they're in part driven by glacier melt. So the summer kind of debris flow things we get are almost exclusively from the glaciers. But the big floods that we get in the fall, they're generally precipitation or rain driven. So the melting glaciers kind of tee up the ball for having a problem by putting all the sediment in the river. But it's the bigger and increasingly big storms that come in that are causing the actual floods that are causing the damage. So the floods itself are from rain.
Great. Someone asks, what will this mean for access up the Nisqually corridor? The park is studying traffic issues there. Should river flooding be considered as part of access for more people?
Well, that is actually one of my main messages. We saw that one example where I gave last winter where all the park entrances closed from things that happened outside the park. I mean, that's a thing that's now happening. We can actually lose access to the park road, the Nisqually Road, because of what happens outside the park. But I was also saying, and I know I went very quickly, but there are at least 4 or 5 areas on the Nisqually that are very high hazard. Now, the imminent threats team is very aware of them, and as is the management team, and they're trying to study them sort of one at a time and coming up with things we can do. Sometimes, though, the forces of nature are such that you can only do something that'll last a few years, and you can't really do a permanent thing. So I expect going forward, there will be closures of the Nisqually Road, but the park finds it very important, and they'll do everything to keep it open or to reopen it.
Great. Someone asks, I could see how barbs would reduce erosion because they slow the water down, but do they add to sedimentation for that reason?
They can actually be designed that way, and we actually would like them to do that, because what you're trying to do in the White River campground where we built the 6 barbs, we would love it if the river started to deposit there, because then you're getting kind of a natural river bank there, and it would just bury the barbs. And then if the river ever decided to go back into the bank, it would hit that rock again. So yes, both barbs can create deposition, which is good for flood protection. And you can actually design engineered log jams, those more expensive structures, to do the same thing. Or you can design the engineered log jam to be kind of neutral and just pass stuff.
Okay, and here's a related question. Did Paul say that wood construction, like engineered log jams, can work for hundreds of thousands of years? Please explain, why doesn't the wood decay?
No, what I said is that they tried to mimic the design of natural deposits in wood, of wood in rivers. And it turns out there's very few rivers like that. And the person who studied it, Tim Abbey, had to actually, I think it was the Quinault River, which is one of the few rivers in the US in Olympic National Park where it's protected all the way to the ocean. Anyway, he found that there were log jams there, and he dated how old the wood was. And some of the wood was hundreds and thousands of years old. So naturally wood can last that long. And usually it only lasts long if it's being wet. I mean, wood, I'm not a wood expert, but if it's exposed to dry air, it's going to deteriorate more quickly. The engineered log jams don't have hundreds of years, but they're certainly expected to last decades. And they will need periodic checking and maintenance, but they can be expected to last decades.
Great. Another question, is the Carbon Canyon Road scheduled to be considered through the Imminent Threats Flood Program?
Yeah, the Carbon Road is a difficult one. And what I said, and I said it kind of quickly, is unfortunately, the Carbon River Road has so many places that the road is lower than the river. And there's a few places where there's almost no forest. And the forest is the only thing that keeps a river that's higher than a road from falling off onto the road. And unfortunately, the Carbon Road is going to be very difficult to reopen as a road. They're working every year to keep it open as a hiking trail and a bike route. But I think any new routes into the Carbon will have to be in a different location. And that is something the park is exploring. And I think that has a much better chance of being maintainable in the future.
Great. So your colleague here asked, does the success of the protection measures along West Side Road increase the likelihood that the road will be reopened someday?
Well, it's really up to the park at this point. I think the road is mechanically stable now, unless something happens drastically this winter. So I think it becomes a matter of funding and other considerations that the management team have to do. But we're getting very close to where there's a sustainable road that can be driven during the summer months.
Great. And is it possible that this mitigation at the park moves the problem outside of the park? That's a good one.
Well, actually, part of the problems outside of the park are from the park, because that sediment I was talking about, it doesn't just stop in the park. You know, it doesn't just deposit in the park rivers, it actually flows outside. As a matter of fact, especially Pierce County is very aware of that, and they're doing a lot to try to protect homes that are along their rivers from the problems that this new sediment is causing outside the park. But I think as the park gets better and better at protecting its roads, and if the similar approaches are not used outside the park, you're going to see more and more closures outside the park, which will obviously keep you from getting to the park. Great. But there's no reason these methods can't be used outside the park. They just have to be applied.
Great. And then someone asks, are the ELJs, that must be the log jams.
Log jams.
Yeah. Recruiting enough new wood to be fairly self-sustaining, or is it too early to tell?
I think it might be a little too early to tell. If we have a really big flood, that'll be the big test. As I recall, the ones on the carbon, some years they appear to be losing racked wood. They don't lose parts of the actual built wood, but the wood that's racked against it will sometimes be gone. But then other years it seems to have a lot of new wood. So I think the jury's still a little bit out what's going to happen long term. But the hope is that they'll gain wood over time and become more and more stable. And that answers the deterioration question. If you're getting new wood to replenish the wood that's becoming weaker, it sort of becomes self-sustaining.
Great. And someone would like to know, Julia would like to know, are fish utilizing the barbs? And if so, what kind of fish?
Actually, I would expect that they're not. That's well above, I think that's above where the salmon are. I'm not a fish biologist. And I think, though, they have actually looked at fish use. Unfortunately, I don't know it, but we don't expect there to be much fish use by where there's just rock. That said, that area was very rocky beforehand. So whatever fish were there before are probably still there. I just think it's probably a no change situation.
Great. And one of our young viewers asked, what is a geomorphologist?
Well, geomorphology, I sort of joke, it's fast geology. But if you look at kind of all the forms and the shapes that you see in the landscape, you know, what you can actually see in the landscape, and the things that actually cause those to be formed. So it's, you know, how do these shapes on the landscape get there, and what are the processes that form them? That really is what geomorphology is. So a geomorphologist is one who comes in and tries to recognize, why does the landscape look the way it does? And then maybe, you know, in our case, we're kind of trying to manipulate those processes to get a benefit here, which is to keep park access.
Great.
I think it's a good thing to get into as we get into climate change. I think geomorphology will become a very valuable tool when you have limited funds and a lot of problems.
Okay. And then our last question, Dylan asks, is there a way to build a dam? So I'm not quite sure what he's asking there, but I'll let you take it there, Paul.
No, we do have very small dams on small streams in the park just so we can get enough water for water supplies. But no, we don't have any dams in the park, mainly because they have a lot of negative aquatic impacts. Also, what they would do here in the park is they would fill up with sediment very quickly because there's so much sediment coming in. And even though our rivers are filling with sediment, they're still passing most of the sediment out. So if you had a dam, you would be catching all that, and you would essentially end up with a full dam very quickly.
Great. Well, thank you, Paul. We're running out of time, so I'm going to close it here, but I really appreciate this presentation. It was so informative and great to hear about these, you know, science-based solutions that we can actually use. So I will just quickly share my screen and remind people that Washington's National Park Fund gave over $650,000 to Mount Rainier Olympic and North Cascades National Park last year to help things with like science and research, like Paul's work, improving visitors' experience, expanding volunteerism and stewardship, and providing for youth and family programs. And we have a lot of great virtual field trips coming up. Go to wnpf.org and you can sign up for any of them. And our 1 and 2 weeks is to Olympic National Park with fish biologist Sam Brinkman. And we're really looking forward to that. So Paul, thank you again. And thank you everyone for joining us today. It was great to learn with you.
Thank you very much. And catch Sam's talk. He's a good guy.
Excellent. Thank you. Bye, everyone.